While we did review the 4GB variant of the GTX 960, when this blower style 2GB variant showed up, I had to have it. You see, the 4GB was not the first GTX 960 to be featured on the channel. Another board of the same reference design was tested first, but it died during testing. It has been used as parts donor ever since. Even the second blower style graphics card benefited from that. I won't talk too much about the GPU, just pause the video, the GPU-Z window has everything available. But the 2GB VRAM can hurt the performance of the GPU compared to its 4GB variant. But before going for the gaming results, the cooling system used is quite terrible. Don't get me wrong, the VRAM has its dedicated heatsink, but the memory is left to its own devices and the blower fan doesn't really do its job with its stock fan curve. The temperature rose to 78°C in heaven for a delta over ambient of 54 degrees. A custom fan curve set in MSI Afterburner is a must if longevity of the card is one of your concerns. The test system is the already familiar custom PC, using the Ryzen 5 3600 and 32GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 3600 MHz this time around. Calling Marvel Rivals playable might be a stretch, especially since 720 resolution and low settings does not bring the 1% lows above 60 FPS. However, 61 FPS for average and 46-41% lows might be good enough to get a sample of how the game plays. If you have a GTX 960, give this one a try. I don't like the presets from Cyberpunk 2077. Low settings has FSR turned on what the game calls auto mode. This then makes 720 resolution difficult to watch. So I tested at 720 low settings but disabled FSR completely. This then had the GTX 960 running at 44 FPS on average and 30 FPS 41% lows. 1080 native resolution is not going to happen, but FSR balanced drops the render pixel count close to that 720 resolution. The performance is then similar, 40 FPS for the average and 28-41% lows. With the VRAM usage above 2GB, the 4GB variant however will provide a couple of FPS more. Technically better, but just technically. The GTX can run the finals acceptably, meaning 1% lows at 60 or above, only at 720 resolution and low settings. The card averages 84 FPS and the 1% lows gets close enough to 60. At the same settings, the 4GB card scores 1 FPS lower average, but 30 FPS higher for the 1% lows. Again, nothing that would be noticeable. Robocop is the first title that punishes the 2GB GTX 960 for its small VRAM. At 720 resolution and low settings, the reference card averages 34 FPS. The more noticeable in-game will however be the 1% lows, of low 20s. By contrast, the 4GB variant gets 37 FPS for the average and more importantly, 30-41% lows, making for a much better game experience. Fortnite pulled a fast one on me by making some changes to the performance rendering mode, so we're left with just the numbers for the 2GB variant, the star of today's video. In performance mode and a view distance set to far, the game stayed playable at all three tested resolutions, with averages ranging from 173 FPS to 245. The 1% low stayed well above 60, 119 FPS being the lowest value. Despite its 2GB of VRAM, the reference GTX 960 can run Terminator Resistance just fine. 1080 resolution and epic settings has the game averaging 47 FPS, while the 1% lows stay in the mid-30s. Adequate for a slow-paced single-player title. The 4GB variant does better, with 50 FPS for the average and 40-41% lows. For this title, more RAM does equal more better. I use a bot match in DA Dust to benchmark CS2, so there's quite a bit of variance from test run to test run. And when it comes to the two variants of the GTX 960, the numbers are too close to be able to tell if the extra 2GB of VRAM have any influence. And that's why I'm only showing the results for the 2GB variant. Averages varying between 171 and 198, and 1% lows between 95 FPS and 100. To keep Far Cry 6 playable, one would need to drop the resolution from 1080 to 720 as the quality increases from low to high. For those combinations, the 2GB GTX 960 averages between high 30s and low 40s, with the 1% lows above 30. In a spectacular fashion, the 4GB performs significantly better, with 1080 low settings averaging 10 FPS more and the 1% lows reaching mid-40s. The experience is much better, and even 1080 and medium settings is playable. I tested Apex Legends at low settings and no texture streaming budget. I aimed here to get as much performance as possible, but with the side effect of oil painting looking textures. The 2GB GTX 960 averages between 99 and 158 FPS, depending on the selected resolution. The 1% low stayed above 60 FPS in all cases, reaching above 10720 resolution. Would 2 extra GB of VRAM have helped? Not that much. You do get about 10 FPS more for the average and about the same increase for the 1% lows. And while showing up consistently in the benchmark log, it's not something I would notice in game. While I could play Doom Eternal on the 2GB card at low settings and even 1080 resolution, it is 1280 by 720 where the card gets the 1% lows above 60. At 1080 the average FPS is 57, but increases to 90 as we drop the resolution to 720, and the 1% low starts off at 43 FPS at Full HD to then go above 60 at 720. More VRAM is more better here, as the same 1080 resolution and low settings has the 4GB variant averaging 70 FPS and the 1% lows are now 50, for a noticeable improvement in how the game feels. Low settings will have Rainbow Six Siege using less than 2GB of VRAM, at least at the 2 resolution and scaling factors used for testing. The card runs an average FPS between 56 at 1080 resolution and 157 at 720 resolution with 50% render scaling. The 1% lows range between 43 and 106 FPS. In my opinion, the better compromise here is 1080 resolution with 50% render scale. You get enough pixels and an average FPS of 92 with 1% lows of 68. 2 extra gigabytes of VRAM won't do much in Overwatch 2, as we'll later see on. For now, the 2GB variant of the GTX 960 averages between 176 FPS at 1080 resolution low settings and 334 at 720. The 1% lows range between 146 and 278. As for the 4GB variant, 1080 and low settings had it averaging 6 FPS higher and had the 1% lows 3 FPS lower. Basically, the two cards run almost identically. I tested Resident Evil 4 using the prioritized performance preset, but I disabled FSR. You lose too much visual fidelity at the low resolutions used for testing. I will call 1600 by 900 playable with the average FPS at 43 and with the 1% lows at 29. Dropping the resolution can help to increase these numbers to 58 and 35 FPS respectively at 720 resolution. But increasing the amount of VRAM to 4GB works even better, and at the same 720 resolution, the other GTX 960 averages 67 FPS and gets the 1% lows at 40. Dota 2 averages 148 at 1080 resolution and low settings, with the exception of the rendering scale. That one was pulled back to 100. The 1% low stays above 60 FPS, so the game plays just fine on the 2GB variant of the GTX 960. Shadow of the Tomb Raider will perform better on the 4GB variant, but not by much. Back to the 2GB sample though, I'll call the game playable at 1080 resolution and medium settings. The canned benchmark averaged 40 FPS and the 1% lows reached 28. You can drop some of the settings though if you need more performance. The alternative would be the 4GB card that averaged 45 FPS and had the 1% lows at 30 under the same testing conditions. Again, not much, but it's there. Borderlands 3, not 4, apparently even current gen cards struggle with that one, so Borderlands 3 is somewhat playable at 1600 by 900 and high settings, with the average FPS at 36 and the 1% lows at 29 FPS. However, 1080 medium is a better deal in my opinion. For a small reduction in visuals, you get more pixels, 45 FPS for the average and 37 for the 1% lows. 2 extra gigabytes do help, but only by 3 extra FPS for the average and also just 3 more for the 1% lows, again at 1080 and medium settings. As mentioned at the beginning, testing the 2GB GTX 960 was done mostly for sentimental reasons. To me it brings closure to a 3 years old video card review that ended prematurely. The card itself is still fine for the easier to run titles, think of Fortnite, CS2, Apex Legends. But the GPU itself is powerful enough to compensate for the 2GB of VRAM even in some of the more demanding titles. How much is too much for the 2GB GTX 960? Well, at $40 and above, the RX 580 is going to be hard to beat, so a fair price would be around $30 or lower. The 4GB variant, however, will go for higher prices than that, and as shown in this video, for little benefit most of the times. Thing is, the GTX 960, be the 2GB or the 4GB variant, has a similar performance to newer cards, and some of them don't even need extra power via 6-pin connectors, unlike the GTX 960 that won't power on without one. And with support for it being officially scheduled to end, the future for the Maxwell cards looks more and more bleak. We'll definitely revisit this card past October 2025. I mean, there are older architectures than the 900 series that will still be featured on the channel. But until then, all that is left is to conclude for this one. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next.